If you follow the development of transit projects in the US, you've probably noticed something odd happening. An insane degree of cost and timeline creep affecting project after project, worse than ever before. It's become a maddeningly familiar sight for transit advocates, as projects get hit with delay after delay, which often causes costs to rise due to normal inflation and the rising cost of labor and materials over time, which causes further delays because now they need to identify more funding before they can begin to build. Repeat ad infinitum. This channel normally focuses on Los Angeles area public transportation, largely because it's where I live and what I know, and I'm very hesitant to speak out of turn about places where I don't have familiarity with the local realities on the ground. I really don't want to Dunning-Kruger myself, which is why this channel is unlikely to ever have videos dedicated solely to other cities. But that said, the issues I'll be discussing today are rampant not only throughout the US, but curiously throughout the English-speaking world. While the final recommendations this video will make are tailored to changes at the local level in Los Angeles and the state level in California, along with some federal recommendations that will be incredibly hard to implement in the current national political environment and which are more long-term goals, many of these recommendations can be applied to the same problems in other cities and states, and even other countries where some of the same issues exist. So, this topic is massively complicated, and there has been a lot of ink spilled on it. That's why I've been so hesitant to take it on in the past, and why it's taken me so long to put this together. At the end of the day, I'm not an urban planner, civil engineer, or a member of any other profession that has unique insight into this issue. Shouting about transit on YouTube is just a hobby, because it's something I'm interested in and passionate about. My actual job, though, can come in handy here. I'm a documentary film producer and editor, so I've decided to attempt a robust examination of this topic a little closer to how I would approach a doc instead of my usual video essay style. In that vein, along with a ton of research I've done myself, I'm leaning on two of the foremost experts who have lived and breathed this issue for a long time, and who are authors in what I believe are the two most comprehensive studies on the issue in the US. First, we have Alon Levy, who is an author on NYU's Transit Costs Project, and then we have Ethan Elkind, who, in addition to having written a fantastic history of LA transportation called Railtown, was an author on a study at Berkeley titled Getting Back on Track. They both graciously gave me some of their time to help me understand the complexity of the problem and where we could go from here. And another thing to note, I foolishly conducted the Alon Levy interview shortly after moving while my internet was still spotty, and long story short, between the internet and an issue with Zoom, the second half of the interview did not properly save. Pretty embarrassing. But I did immediately take notes on what was discussed and will occasionally relay some important points Levy made from the latter half of that interview where there's no video. So, let's get into it. How bad is the problem? Well, locally in Los Angeles, the writing's been on the wall for a while. Let's take the Crenshaw line. Originally slated to open in 2018, actually opened in October of 2022, and even then, just the northern portion. The southern portion won't be open until next year. The Vermont BRT, just now finally starting environmental review, was in a community engagement scoping phase for 10 years. Link Union Station Phase 1 was fully funded and set to open by 2028, but absolutely insane contract shenanigans have left it floundering, costs rose, and Metro doesn't have the money to cover the shortfall, so now it will at best be open by 2033. Environmental review periods on every single project in the design phase have been lengthening by years compared to similar projects from the previous decade. The so-called quick-build BRT on Broadway that was intended to be done within 1 year is now going to take at least 5 years and somehow get done slower than a normal BRT. And this is all before wading into the morass of delays and cost increases from California high-speed rail, which has left a considerable black eye on a very high-profile project that is fundamentally necessary for both the state and for the future development of high-speed rail in the US. And nationally, the rest of the US isn't faring any better. You can see from NYU's Transit Costs Project that the cost per kilometer of tunnel construction in the US is near the very top, 6 times what it costs us in countries like Spain and South Korea.
Our costs in the U.S. are way out of line compared to other advanced economies that have representative government like we do. We don't have the same level of expertise at building rail projects that you see in other countries where that really is a more major mode of transportation. Whereas in the United States, because we're a more rural country and we're dominated politically at the federal level by rural states and rural interests, we're much more about building highways. And so when rail is built, it's sort of sporadic, ad hoc. Even within a major metropolitan area, and sometimes different agencies are building different projects. So we don't have that expertise built up. You see this acutely with high-speed rail, where high-speed rail has not been built at all in North America And so the California projects first out of the gate were really struggling with that. There are different aspects of these jobs get contracted out to different consultants.
It's very common to use consultants for things. Okay, I mean, they hire consultants in France, they hire consultants in Italy, they hire consultants in Spain, but they do more in-house work. So in Spain, I was told the third-party costs are 5%, and then in New York, it's 21%. So one of the things that we found in the study is that the soft cost multiplier is much higher in the US than in our comparison cases.
When you say soft costs, that involves the design and scoping phase of the project, is that correct?
Yeah, soft costs so hard cost is physical construction. It also includes management done by physical construction. So the soft cost is stuff like design, engineering, overall management when that's needed. And this is getting worse.
This is one of the most frequent criticisms you hear about transit construction in the US. Essentially, we're novices, plagued by rookie mistakes. We've been building highways continuously for generations, but the heyday of American transit construction has long since passed. We're taking baby steps again, relearning how to progress through every stage of the process, and hiring out even more of the work that can be done in-house by career transit agency experts. Part of the problem seems to be the type of people we are hiring.
Part of it is just an ideology that the private sector is more efficient than the government. The consultants don't like being subordinated to the government, but also US and UK have a culture of generalists. You're not supposed to be a subject matter expert. If you're a subject matter expert, then you are too siloed. That's the language that's being used. And the upshot is that they de-emphasize the role of the engineers. There's a lot of prestige in engineering in Italy and the entire Spanish and Portuguese-speaking world. It's also historically a thing in Northern Europe and Germany. It's kind of legendary how prestigious engineering here is. But in the United States, the agencies are completely incompetent at this, so they hire consultants to cover their incompetence. But they can't manage the consultants, so they tell the consultants to study everything. This means that a lot of the discourse is not about construction costs. It's about cost overruns. They're so paranoid about issues of cost overrun, like people talking about social trust and whatnot, that instead of talking about how to build, they just slap a contingency and then evaluate themselves by their own inflated budgets.
This issue with contingencies has been one of the biggest drivers of costs in the US at the federal level in the past several years. Any project that wants a federal grant from the FTA, and most transit megaprojects will need one, need to comply with FTA rules about how high of a contingency they budget for. Now, the calculation of this number is rather complicated, but one of the relevant changes the FTA made was to increase what they called the risk threshold from 50% to 65%, essentially meaning that a transit agency has to budget in enough contingency that the project is 65% likely to come in within its new budget. That sounds reasonable, right? Well, in practice, the way this is calculated, you get sky-high new contingency percentages that are way out of line with the rest of the world. For example, Levy told me that Italy's number was around a 10% contingency. The East San Fernando Valley line in Los Angeles saw an over $800 million increase for required contingency funds following the FTA's risk assessment, totaling nearly 30% of the previous project cost. That's a contingency triple the size commonly required outside of the US. And for other LA Metro projects, it's causing a huge problem. The West Santa Ana branch was slapped with a $900 million contingency, over 18% of the budget, that after inflation calculations has increased the project cost from $4.9 billion to $7.1 billion. Overall, nearly a 45% increase that they're still scrambling to figure out, thus far unsuccessfully. And the East Side E-Line extension had an over 47% contingency applied that, after escalation, over doubled the project budget, necessitating that Metro settle for building a much shorter initial operating segment. These contingencies have wreaked absolute havoc on the costs and timelines of LA's projects. And there were questions about the FTA's motivation in doing this.
There was outcry from Democrats in Congress that this was basically a political attempt by the Trump FTA to try to eke out transit projects.
No, it had nothing to do with Trump. It has nothing to do with Trump.
Really? Okay.
It's something that's still ongoing. It is also not a purely American problem. It is a problem of the English-speaking world. If you say making a New York City subway station elevator should cost about $12 million, because of other problems with both hard costs and soft costs, it's up 45 or 50, and then they say 70. Because they think that if they say 50 and they deliver 55, they'll get egg on their face, and if they say 70 and deliver 65, they will call themselves heroes.
So yes, the idea is that politically, it's easier to, instead of doing the hard work to get costs under control, just increase the budget massively and then say, hey look, we actually came in under budget. And the thing is, it's not like the need for contingencies is totally unfounded. Oftentimes projects have been proposed with artificially low budgets for political reasons.
There is a very long history of political leaders really sort of overselling a project just to get it started. Some of them have just admitted this, outright, that I'm not going to be around when the budget balloons and we're just trying to get the ribbon cutting going and get the project going, because once it gets started, it's hard politically to pull the plug on a project and just abandon it.
There's been allegations that California High-Speed Rail was a serious offender in this regard, starting out with cost estimates that were drastically unrealistic due to perhaps a combination of agency inexperience and political maneuvering. And the FTA claims that since implementing this change to risk assessment and contingencies, the number of on-budget capital investment grantee projects has increased from 62 to 89%. But in practice, the FTA is punishing every transit agency whether they're trying to constrain the budget or not, because when that increased budget becomes available, thanks to the contingency requirements, it will get used by the contractors. Meaning that if Metro could have built a project for billions less, well, they're not going to get the opportunity to even try. They're forced to delay the project, scrambling to scrape together more funds that they may not even need, especially if they've done the hard work on the other issues we're discussing to constrain the budgets, or that they may only need because of the cost escalation that comes from inflation that you have to deal with due to the longer timelines needed to find the extra funding in the first place. These contingencies aren't a solution to any problem. They're a total surrender to the problem. It's just a way to politically save face without doing any of the hard work, while functionally making the problem even worse. And this isn't the only part of the process where politics are creating massive issues. At least in LA, where countless tiny municipalities dot the landscape, political meddling might actually be the original sin of the transit cost explosion, at the very first step of the process, in scoping, aka figuring out what to build in the first place.
In the United States and in California, our system of governance is really decentralized. Many of these rail transit projects will span multiple local government jurisdictions, and then you've got county jurisdictions over that. So all of those entities end up having some sort of veto, in many cases, over these projects. So that's one big challenge, that you've got to line up not only all this political support, but all these approvals. And you have a lot of entities willing to hold these projects hostage unless they get concessions, and those concessions can add costs and time.
If some local contractor demands something, they will ask the consultants to study that as well, and the consultants have to get paid for that. So they are just very inefficient with constraining the problem to something that is tractable so that one team of engineers could actually do it.
I mean, if you look at LA Metro's governance system, the Board of Supervisors are a third of the seats. They're county representatives, so only one of them really, or a couple of them, are representing kind of the heart of LA. And they all have to answer to some of these small cities throughout their chunk of what's really a massive county. So right off the bat, you're heavily weighted towards essentially some of the smaller, almost rural parts of the county. They have a lot of outsized political influence over the LA Metro board. It's not really the ideal way to design things if you want to solve regional problems at a regional scale.
To summarize so far, we have the scope of a lot of our transit projects decided by politicians who are trying to appease tiny local jurisdictions, forcing transit agencies to hire consultants both study a vast range of options and perhaps move forward with unnecessarily expensive alternatives in order to achieve the political consensus needed to build the project in the first place. The agencies themselves are often staffed by generalists, not specialists, who may not understand why it's not worth having consultants study certain options in the first place, leading again to far more comprehensive studies than necessary, and a lot of the specialists may not even want to work in-house at these transit agencies due to both an inherent distrust of government in the US and the bother of being jerked around by the aforementioned political winds. This agency-level incompetence, combined with more political maneuvering, sometimes leads to a lowball of the cost at the outset of the project, which has caused the FTA and some local agencies to artificially balloon the contingencies of all transit projects, whether or not the costs were initially lowballed, because the appearance of coming in under budget is easier to achieve than the hard work of trying to actually constrain the budget. And what I forgot to mention on top of all this, procurement, the process of hiring contractors for the environmental studies, design, and construction of a project, is also plagued by issues of transparency.
Procurement is just completely broken. So in Italy, they require itemization as a transparency measure. In the United States, everything is okay. And so with this opacity, everything gets litigated later, and that means they're going to spend more money. And as a result, contractors hate doing business with the American public sector. Just due to agency abuse, that by itself add 20%. And you had 20% here, you have 20%, you have excessive contingencies, you have even more risk compensation for other things. Very easily, your cost just double, just straight out.
So yes, issues with incompetency in agencies also causes contractors to add more contingencies of their own to their bids, leading to things like the insane elevator cost example that Levy mentioned earlier. Now, I will say, going into this, I expected more of the issue with cost overruns to come from the hard cost side. I was wondering whether using private contractors who need profit built into the project costs were artificially inflating things, and whether forming a state-owned construction company, which LA Metro is now actually looking into, a la the Army Corps of Engineers, might not be a better solution. But while this could bring costs down, it does seem, at least relative to other countries, that this isn't one of the core issues.
Everywhere in the world that I'm aware of uses private contractors for this. Nominally communist countries like Vietnam use foreign contractors. Vietnam's construction costs are rather high because Vietnam has no state capacity for this.
And another issue I was surprised about is something that often gets referred to as citizen voice. There's a great article by Vice, which I'll link to in the description, that lays a lot of the blame for our transit building issues on the weaponization of our environmental laws and letting local, often wealthy interests stall projects with threats and litigation. The article makes a case as well that our community outreach is often misguided, asking citizens for specific input on technical decisions that they're not qualified to make instead of general input on their travel needs that the agencies can then use to inform technical decisions. And I feel the issues with so-called citizen voice are some of the most visible ones in LA. You have the cartoonishly villainous former Ticketmaster CEO trying to block the Sepulveda subway, one of the most crucial transit projects in the nation, so the project doesn't tunnel under his neighborhood of Bel Air, despite the fact that there would be virtually no surface impacts and the tunnels would be often hundreds of feet below the mountaintop homes. All of this done seemingly out of spite. This is, of course, all tied into the earlier point about fragmented jurisdictions and hyperlocal interests threatening to stall or kill projects. But each expert had a different take on this.
LA Metro, even though it's got billions of dollars to spend and is doing these critical projects, is essentially held hostage by all these little cities in the county. You have a lot of little power centers that have veto over these projects, whether that's through litigation from citizens groups or it's local government that won't issue a permit for construction. In some cases, it's state processes. I mean, this is what I found in writing my book on the history of Metro Rail, that getting this whole decentralized group of players to agree on any one thing, any one project, has been a challenge almost from the beginning of the rail program in LA. And then also, to get political consensus, it means you're compromising like crazy on the nature of the project and the design of the project.
Levy, however, in the second half of the conversation, downplayed citizen voice. They pointed out that, when challenged, the government almost always wins. For example, the California High-Speed Rail Authority got their chosen route to San Jose despite citizen outcry. Metro will probably win any lawsuit that Bel Air brings against it.
I think the real example of this is the Beverly Hills School District wasting, millions of dollars in school district funds to sue over the Purple Line and losing badly on multiple appeals as well. But that's my sense. Just talking to a few Metro folks, I think that, they want to make sure that they've got a really bulletproof case when they do get sued. Because anytime Metro is designing a big project, they just know they're going to get sued by somebody.
And Metro does often make concessions, as Elkind said, to local political interests, if not necessarily to local private citizens, that can massively affect costs and timelines. When threatened with a lawsuit from San Dimas over the Foothill extension, Metro made concessions that will add costs. When threatened with a lawsuit over the West Santa Ana branch from Cerritos, Metro did the same, and from Lawndale over the South Bay extension, the same. And it seems they may be doing so again on the South Bay extension as Redondo Beach is threatening ridiculous lawsuits. It seems it's easier for Metro to just pay a little to settle these quickly than to deal with them mucking things up. And those costs do add up. Furthermore, there's permitting concessions that slow everything down. Beverly Hills famously limits construction between Thanksgiving and New Year's for the convenience of shoppers on Rodeo Drive, which Metro should not have to bend over backwards to accommodate. But here we are. Metro has been putting an insane amount of time into community engagement and scoping, 10 years in the case of the Vermont BRT, seemingly out of a desire to avoid issues down the line. But anyone can see how unbelievably excessive that is at a glance. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't own up to the fact that I'm kind of guilty of some of these citizen voice shenanigans on my own. I was heavily pushing, along with some others, for Metro to study a spur option for the Crenshaw North extension, as it seemed to me to be by far the best option to preserve future expansion. by spurring a huge number of comments, we actually got them to conduct a feasibility study on it. Turns out it wasn't technically feasible. Now, this seemed to be a pretty limited study, and it may have just been their engineers doing a quick write-up of, hey, idiots, here's why this won't work. But I am a citizen without technical knowledge who, even though my motivation was trying to improve rather than kill a project, got them to waste time and probably money studying something that didn't ultimately make sense. It's not like I was going to sue them if they didn't, though. Threats that Metro does have to deal with constantly.
I mean, I think it's kind of incumbent upon policymakers to really examine the laws under which some of these lawsuits happen. Now, some of them are fair game. We want to be able to call our agencies to account. Metro isn't perfect. There are often alternative design and mitigation measures that don't cost a lot of money that should be considered. There is a role for litigation. There's a role for citizen oversight because our agencies do make mistakes. But when you get into a situation where it's just well-heeled neighborhood groups that are really just gumming up the works in a way that everyone can tell it's just not a productive line of attack. I mean, we've seen this in a lot of different contexts in California where you have environmentally beneficial projects that get sued over grounds that kind of make people roll their eyes.
Our environmental law in California, CEQA, has been weaponized a lot of late via litigation or threats thereof to force transit projects into infinite studies. A law that is supposed to help improve the environment being used to slow projects that would help the environment, mind you, while highway projects still seem to be magically fast-tracked. On that point, actually, there's another issue local to California, but I expect relevant to other places as well. Caltrans, the state transit authority that oversees Amtrak service in California as well as highway construction, is, shall we say, not friendly to rail. Anytime a rail line interacts with a highway, they need to approve it. And they have not historically been friendly about giving an inch to transit at the expense of car infrastructure. The entire agency seems staffed with people actively hostile to the idea of transit. In fact, a whistleblower was recently demoted for raising an alarm within the agency that it was violating its own environmental rules in expanding a highway, which is at least thankfully leading to more public scrutiny of Caltrans. They're deferring to freight rail companies and pushing the extremely non-viable solution of hydrogen trains instead of standard electrification to make our rails zero emission. Transit agencies and activists are essentially fighting against their own state transit agency here in California and our own environmental laws on top of everything else we've mentioned. So, yeah, this is just a complicated morass of issue upon issue piling up and drowning us. It's not one thing, it's a lot of things. And while transit agencies try to focus on plugging one leak, they often end up making things worse somewhere else. LA Metro, for example, recently rescinded an RFP for a contract to try to revise it to create tighter language that would keep the project more on track. But in doing so, it delayed the new RFP by so long that the project was delayed even more than it probably would have been under a substandard contract anyway. With some of this stuff, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. So what can we actually do?
You compare the projects to what happens in Europe where, they're not trying to gold plate every station and appease every stakeholder. They're just doing like bare bones. Let's just get the lines trenched at one station design that's simple and cheap. I mean, that's part of the reason for their success, in addition to the fact that they're more sort of centralized in their permitting and approvals. So one of our recommendations in our report is that we should essentially, at the state level, if not national level, think about sort of standing up an agency that can go into almost any jurisdiction that has the knowledge and the in-house capacity and expertise and can build rail projects, and not to steamroll locals, but there's no point in having every city sort of reinvent the wheel. And, the more bespoke kind of stuff, you can have locals take care of that, when it's about individual geography or politics or whatever. But the hardcore aspect of how to contract, how to design, how to do the basics, if you had a sort of strike force team that could go into any agency, any city in the country, I think you would see a lot more of that in-house expertise, a lot less need for outside consulting, and a lot less, agencies making these sort of repeated mistakes, over budgeting for things, over designing things, and overpaying for things. The state could also give that master permitting authority to a transit agency so they're not held hostage by some of these small cities along the route. That would make a big difference.
A state-level authority, not just in California, but in other states as well, would allow institutional knowledge to be built up and retained, which wouldn't be possible in places that don't have consistent transit construction. Ironically, LA is one of the few places that will have consistent transit construction for at least a generation, and should be building up their in-house expertise, or at least trying to. I don't know what it would take to lure some of the best talent away from consulting firms to government agencies, Bigger salaries, perhaps, but also a culture that respects your expertise more and doesn't subject it to political whim as much. At the very least, at the state level, we could reform CEQA. It's about 50 years old at this point and horribly outdated. If we unshackle our agencies from the massive burden that CEQA imparts in the form of studies, and protect transit agencies better against local lawsuits and fast-track the ones that do happen, then we can maybe have transit agencies that don't have to pile on concession after concession to deal with local cities and interests, increasing costs where it doesn't make sense. There is a CEQA exemption now for BRT and light rail projects that don't require acquiring private property, but that restriction severely limits what it can get used for, and doesn't help the most critical of our infrastructure projects. And giving master permitting authority to Metro or a state transit agency would massively help Metro construct projects in a more reasonable time frame, without dealing with crap like the Beverly Hills holiday shutdown. Of course, this doesn't solve the issue of politicians running the Metro board and bending over backwards to pressure from local interests for political rather than process reasons. This is actually one of the hardest issues to solve, because it pretty much requires politicians, and more rural interests, to give up their outsized power. Almost a microcosm of the problem of trying to end the Electoral College in the US, interestingly enough. I think the best we might be able to do is get some internal staffers at Metro as additional votes on the Metro board to balance out the political appointees. Even just getting a third of the Metro board to be internal staff would probably help a lot, and that would have to be a local push. But for LA and California, as Elkind said, a lot of our problems could be addressed with a state transit bill package that A, reforms CEQA, making it easier for transit and active transportation projects to be built, along with transit-oriented development, with more streamlining and legal protections. B, massively reforms Caltrans, or even subordinating it to a new transit-focused authority that has the salaries and culture to attract the best and most experienced talent to work with local agencies without making rookie mistakes, even importing talent from overseas, like Amtrak's famed train daddy. C, grants master permitting authority to transit agencies. D, provides a more consistent funding mechanism for California Transit and California High-Speed Rail that makes projects less reliant on federal funding, given the absolute shit show that is the federal government. I mean, that FTA contingency needs to go, and there absolutely should be a massive transit infrastructure bill to address climate change that is many times larger than the previous infrastructure bill, but I think putting our faith in a functional federal government in the near term is tough when the Senate in particular is dominated by rural states and still maintains the filibuster. And E, not really related to cost or timelines, but while we're doing a state transit bill, commit to electrifying regional rail instead of this hydrogen bullshit. Similar to how the LA City Council scandal spurred action on local redistricting reform, the Caltrans scandal can help spur action here. California is the 5th largest economy on Earth. We can afford to fund transit projects, and there's lots of ways to do it, including the incredibly obvious solution of shifting money from climate-damaging highway projects. Again, something that can be helped by reforming Caltrans. California has a Democratic supermajority in the state government, including some very transit-friendly reps from the LA area. I think getting a massive transit and CEQA reform bill through the California legislature is actually extremely achievable with unified pressure from constituents and advocacy groups, and I think there should be a serious push for this. I'm more concerned about Newsom signing such a bill, considering his recent veto streak in preparation for his inevitable presidential run, but maybe we'll get a governor next cycle who isn't looking past the job to the fantasy of the next one. Can we just, get Jerry Brown back again? No? But there's a pretty large coalition we can build to counter the NIMBY voices that often dominate local politics.
And in terms of the coalition to make this happen, I mean, it's got to be the folks that care about urban mobility and care about quality of life and equity. Transit's a huge equity issue, so I mean, that could be a combination of infill real estate developers, environmentalists. The YIMBY groups, I think, would really be helpful here. You could have some conservation groups too. We're concerned about sprawl and highway building. Labor unions too. They really are major beneficiaries of these rail projects. And that could be a successful formula. I'm not a political organizer or strategist, but it seems like there's enough ingredients there that would if you focused at the state level, you could potentially see some reforms that would lead to success.
Easy, right? But it is achievable. These two studies have a ton of incredible detail, and further recommendations I didn't have time to get into here, so you should check them out if you're interested. Links, as always, are in the description. One of the salient points that I want to talk about soon in a different video is that we should set aside some funding for advanced planning so future projects don't get screwed by a lack of foresight. This is kind of one of my crusades here in LA, as evidenced by the whole Crenshaw North thing I mentioned. Ultimately, like I said, I'm not an expert in this field, but I've tried to summarize the issue from the perspective of those who are. Inevitably, I'll have gotten things wrong or oversimplified certain things, so I imagine there will be a robust debate in the comments. And if any corrections and/or clarifications are needed, I will pin them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and let's get out there and form some coalitions to make some change.